unbelievable. This Sunday, this is
Now, this is something you don't
an article
see very
in the
often
Saratoga
up
National
north,
Historical
because
Parks
I didn't even know
on
we
Africans
had
and how they were
slaves at
treated.
this time. But
Now,
Eden, London,
this is, I'm going to read it
slave of
word for
Daniel
word so you
Goodrich,
know exactly what
enlisted
it
in
says.
Revolutionary
But this
War,
Sunday,
August
7 February
1776,
2016,
though still
the
a
Saratoga
slave,
National Historical Park
1779,
is going to present
when he was
a
discharged,
talk on American history.
and
He
he
wrote
died
a
March
nice
of
story in
1810.
today's blog.
So
I'm
that was my
interested in the
first
section of the
slave I've
first
ever
person
come
be
across.
clear of these options. One of my favorite stories, and favorite, I mean, this is just a poor guy, is an American named Eden London from Winchendon and Hatfield, Mass. Now, this is really close to home. This is most likely because I have had a lifetime interest in the American War of Independence. In particular, I have a 35-plus year interest in the 10th Massachusetts Regiment, which is the regiment that London served in. I believe that much of the interest is because my friend and fellow historian Henry Cook has shared much of his research on the regiment. London first came to my attention because of the research of George Quintal in the MPS study, The Patriots of Color, African and Native Americans at Battle Road and Bunker Hill. Here, I'm going to share some of the research now. London was a slave who in July 1776 was sold to Daniel Goodrich, also of Winchendon. Shortly thereafter, London enlisted in the army for 3 years, and Goodrich received the whole of his bounty and part of his wages. After the war, Eden London lived in both Winchendon and Hatfield. London became destitute and needed community support, which led to a court case. The question considered by the court was which town was liable for London's support. The Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts finally decreed that neither town was liable because London was a free man, stating slavery was abolished in 1780. Well, this is 1810, and the guy's still a slave, and he's being sold all over the place. About 15 years ago, my wife and I had the opportunity to find his grave, which is in the Center Cemetery in Winchendon, Massachusetts. Now, it's way in the back, and it's definitely kept away from the rest of the people. I don't know what they were afraid of. But it says age 31, Negro, rank private, no occupation, status slave, residence, Fitchburg, Massachusetts. Now, Fitchburg, Massachusetts, for anybody who doesn't know, is very close to Winchendon, and Hatfield is probably about 30 miles away. Now, this goes on to say the respected Lancaster, Mass. historian Norse described Eden London as colored. There was a London Negro of Joseph Moore who was baptized at the Choxet Church in Lancaster on 16 June 1744, and who is most likely the same person as the soldier described below. Due to the legal case of Winchendon versus Hatfield, it was known as in 19 years he changed masters no less than 11 times. Now, this is after it was illegal. Besides twice enlisting in the Continental Army. He enlisted in the 8-month service from Fitchburg, Mass. On 10 May 1775 under the company of Captain James Burr and ASA Whitcomb's regiment. His name appears on the 3 June 1775 order to advance pay. On the 1st of August 1775, the muster roll, and in 1775 in October, the company returned. North State said he fought in Bunker Hill. There's no record of service, but with General Bergamore preparing to advance into northern New York, the call went out for soldiers to meet the serious threat. He enlisted from Winchendon on 7 December 1776 for 3 years in the Continental Army in William Warner's company in Colonel Thomas Marshall's 10th Massachusetts Regiment. This unit fought valiantly in both battles of Saratoga and spent the winter at Valley Forge with George Washington. I mean, this man was really a hero. The unit fought through the winter and then fought in the stifling heat on Monmouth, New Jersey from January 1779. He served at West Point. Now, there's another thing. He was served at West Point. He was discharged on 7 December 1779. The history of Winchendon describes an important legal case in which Eden London was the principal character. The slave case is a curious fact that the question whether chattel slaves existed in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was settled in part by the case in which the town was involved as a party at law. The subject is referred to in an article which appeared in the historical magazine New York in 1866, written apparently in the spirit hostile to the fair fame of the state. A reply to the article appeared in the Boston Daily Advertiser, and a concise statement of this case goes into the period of our narrative. Now, this is unbelievable. On the 2nd of August, 1804, the town voted that the selectmen should see and take care of the matter considering the Negro, that the town of Ipswich had notified the town and take support. No name is given, but it is supposed that it's the same person referred to in the action taken in March 1805. Choose Thomas Graydon and Thomas Greenwood, agents, to look into the matter of Eden London, named in the records of Court Eden, a poor Negro man, and find out where he ought to be supported. On the 6th of May following, it was further voted that the agents, with the assistance of the selectmen of the town of Weston and the town of Hatfield, or any other town, as soon as he can give knowledge which town said London was left a citizen according to the law. Later still, on the 18th of August 1806, the agents were directed to carry on the suit against Hatfield concerning Eden London according to the best course they can get. In a final issue, and at the same time, a grant of $50 was made to carry out the lawsuit. The contrast is now between Hatfield and Winchendon. It had been brought before a justice of the peace in Worcester, where the decision was favor of Hatfield, affirming the decision of the justice. The case was tried on December 1806, and it was appealed to the Supreme Judicial Court March term 1808. The record of the Court of Common Pleas, as certified by the presiding justice, as follows. And it says Worcester, 1806. The town of Winchendon in the county of Worcester. Complaints against the town of Hatfield and the county of Hampshire before this Court of Appeal from the education of Honorable Dwight Foster, Esquire, one of the justices of peace, who's for said county, setting forth a complaint that Eden London, a Negro man now resident in the town of Winchendon, is poor and became charitable to said town, and that the town of Hatfield is the place of the lawful settlement, and praying that may be so adjudged. The facts of the case from the evidence before the court is that said Eden in the year 1757 was a proper estate of one Samuel Bond, and then by him sold to William Williams at Weston. That same time in 1760, and after the decease of Williams, said Eden was set off to the estate of Williams, to the wife of Oliver Partridge of Hatfield, who was the daughter of said deceased, as part of the portion of the deceased estate, and then went on to live with said Partridge in the town of Hatfield and continued to be servant until the 2nd of October, 1767, at which time he was sold to Partridge to John Ingersoll, Esquire of Westfield, in said county of Hampshire. Continued with him about 3 years, and then was sold to said Ingersoll to John M. McCluster of Long Meadow. Now, these are places all over the place. I'm talking, this is a long way away in 1810. It's not around the corner. And then in just a few weeks, he was sold by McCluster to Joshua Holcomb of Simsbury, Connecticut. Now he's in another state, and lived with him about 4 years. Then he was sold by Holcomb to William Bond of Lincoln. Now, again, that's way down where we're fighting, and lived with him a short time. Was then sold to said Bond to Thomas Cowden of Fitchburg. Now he's back near Winchendon, and lived there 3 or 4 years. Then he was sold to Cowden to Jonathan Stimson of Winchendon, and the day following he absconded and enlisted in the 8-month service of Cambridge, and before he expiration of the same 8-month service, and in the year 1775, he was sold by Simpson to Thomas Sawyer of Winchendon, which he lived for some time. Then he was sold again to Daniel Goodrich at the same Winchendon in the month of July 1776, with whom he lived about 5 weeks. Then he enlisted again into the Continental Army, and he did 3 years service, and Goodrich received all the money, all the wages, and all the honor that he did. Such was the case before the Court of Common Pleas, which affirmed the judgment of Justice Foster, and adjudged that London settlement was not in Hatfield, and may be said in passing that according to tradition, Eden London had his freedom from Mr. Goodrich on condition that he, London, should take the place of his master in the 3 years of service. This case was brought on by the Supreme Court at Worcester in 1807, when Upham appears in behalf of his plaintiff, that is the town of Winchendon. The case was continued in the March term. Bigelow argued the case for the town. After hearing the arguments, the court justice Parsons presiding decided as follows. It is stated that the pauper was once the slave of Oliver Partridge, living several years with him in Hatfield, where his master was settled. The pauper was acquired in a derivative settlement in Hatfield. Afterwards, his master sold him to J. Ingersoll, Esquire, an inhabitant, and settled in Westfield. There he lived several years with his new master. Then he lost his settlement in Hatfield by gaining a new derivative settlement in Westfield. Either a slave or freeman, it is unnecessary to pursue the case further. Having lost the settlement in Hatfield and not having regained a new settlement here, the defendants are not liable for maintenance and judgment and an affirming cost. The decision relieved Hatfield from the support of Eden London and threw the cost on the town of Winchendon. But most Winchendon continued to support him. It was claimed by the town's council, Mr. Bigelow, among other things, that a slave could obtain a settlement by length of residence, and not merely from his master. It was further claimed that by 2 decisions by the Supreme Court it had been decided that slavery could not exist in the Commonwealth, and it was the first action referring to involving the rights of the master which came before the Supreme Court. After the establishment of the Constitution, the judges declared that by virtue of the first article of the Declaration of Rights, slavery in the state was no longer. Afterward, in an action by the inhabitants of Littleton brought by maintained expenses supporting a Negro tried in Middlesex, October 1796, the Chief Justice, in directing the jury, stating the unanimous opinion of the court that a Negro born in the state before the present Constitution was born free, although born of a female slave. If the decision should stand, London was legally a free man when he lived in Hatfield and had settled in his own right, which was never forfeited, since he had been removed without any regard to his own wishes. But Judge Parsons said his associates dismissed this matter until the court remarks, "It is, however, very certain that the general practice and common usage has been opposed to, in his opinion. This decision settled this point, that before the Revolution, the settlement of a slave always followed that of his master. Eden's residence was therefore, because of his last three masters lived in this town, they belonged there. Again, the decision affirmed the slaves, when manumitted, could acquire a settlement in their own right, and that they were resided over a year in the town where they were manumitted, they could then be warned out. Whichever of these decisions the court was right. The more humane one of the court in 1796 on the possibly more legal one of the court in 1808. The town was obliged to support Eden London's old age, and as he did service in the War of Independence. It is hoped that the maintenance he cheerfully rendered is come here to us, and he was a pretty smart man. He was probably an old man by this time, as it was 51 years from the time he began to figure, or rather be figured in, the sales and final decisions. He was buried in the old graveyard of Winchendon, which is what I have. He was defied by people of choice, and particularly in battles. It was determination of our forefathers, including African American soldiers, in surrounding overwhelming odds to help define the American spirit, the will and ability to share a better future. It is the people that define this community by choice and by chance, and they've changed this country and even the world in political development. That is why studying people of Saratoga is helpful in understanding the way life once was. I hope you enjoyed this information.